The fifth night began like the others, a quiet dinner with Mason, followed by a quick kiss goodnight as I grabbed my coat to meet Eliza. It had become routine. Mason didn't ask why I needed to spend so many evenings away, he trusted me, or maybe he just didn't want to hear the answers. He'd shrug, his attention already drawn back to his laptop, and I'd step into the crisp evening air, guilt clinging to my skin like frost. Eliza had been my best friend for years, her easy laugh and sharp wit a balm to my restless soul. Lately, though, something had shifted. Her jokes lingered in the space between us, her gaze held mine longer than it should, and the casual brush of her hand on my arm left a strange heat that I didn't understand. Or maybe I didn't want to. That night, we ended up in her apartment, the low hum of music filling the room. A bottle of wine was half empty on the table, and our laughter carried the edge of something unspoken. I don't know how it happened. One moment we were talking, and the next, her lips were on mine, her hands pulling me closer. The world spun, my body moving on autopilot as my mind screamed for me to stop. But I didn't. When I woke up the next morning, the room felt colder than it should have. I dressed quickly, avoiding Eliza's sleepy eyes and the mess of tangled sheets. The air between us was heavy with things neither of us dared say. I left her apartment with a promise I couldn't keep, "We'll talk later," and drove home, my heart pounding as I rehearsed what I needed to tell Mason. The drive home felt like an eternity. My fingers trembled against the steering wheel, the morning sun burning my skin as though it knew my sin and sought to brand me with it. Shame crawled under my skin, a living, breathing thing that clung to me no matter how much I tried to shake it off. The guilt was unbearable, but it was the confusion that left me hollow. I loved Mason, didn't I? He was the steady anchor in my chaos, the one person who always knew how to calm me when the storms raged too loud in my mind. And yet, last night, I hadn't thought of him at all. I parked the car in our driveway, sitting there for a moment as my breath hitched in my chest. I wanted to cry, to scream, to unburden myself of the sick feeling curling inside me, but I couldn't. The tears wouldn't come. Instead, I sat in suffocating silence, the weight of my betrayal pressing me deeper into the seat. Walking into the house felt surreal, like stepping onto a stage where everyone knew their lines except me. Mason was in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, sipping coffee as the smell of toast and eggs filled the room. He smiled when he saw me, the warmth in his eyes a knife to my gut. "Hey, how was last night?" he asked, his voice casual, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. "Fine," I replied too quickly, my voice brittle as glass. I need to talk to you." His brow furrowed as he set his mug down, concern flickering across his face. "What's wrong?" The words caught in my throat. How could I possibly say it? How could I tell him that I had destroyed the quiet life we had built together with a single reckless act? But the thought of keeping it inside, of letting the lie fester and grow, was worse. I had to tell him. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling at my sides. "Something happened last night," I began, my voice shaking as I forced the words out. "With Eliza. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen." Mason's expression didn't change at first. He just stared at me, his lips slightly parted as though the words I had spoken hadn't quite registered. And then, slowly, his shoulders sagged, and he let out a long breath, one that carried more weight than I could have imagined. "I see," he said finally, his tone measured. Too measured. I braced myself for the shouting, the accusations, the inevitable fallout that was sure to follow. But it didn't come. Instead, Mason simply looked at me, his face unreadable. "The important thing," he said, his voice steady, "is that it wasn't with another man." His response hit me like a slap. Relief and confusion collided in a dizzying mix, leaving me reeling. I stared at him, trying to process his words, his calm, his almost detached acceptance of what I had done. "That's it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're not angry?" "I didn't say that," he replied, his gaze sharp, cutting through me like a blade. But it could have been worse. You could have, he stopped himself, running a hand through his hair as though trying to push away a thought he didn't want to voice. You could have been with someone who'd threaten what we have. His words left me breathless, the weight of them sinking deep into my chest. I wanted to argue, to tell him that what I had done was just as bad, that betrayal was betrayal no matter the form it took. But I couldn't find the strength. All I could do was nod, shame burning hot on my skin. I don't know what to say, I murmured. Don't say anything, Mason replied, his voice quiet but firm. Not now. He turned away, his movements slow, deliberate, as though he were carrying the weight of my confession on his back. I watched him leave the room, my heart shattering with every step he took. I wanted to follow him, to beg for forgiveness, to promise that it would never happen again. But I stayed rooted to the spot, paralyzed by my own guilt. As the sound of his footsteps faded, the house grew unbearably silent. I sank into the nearest chair, burying my face in my hands as the enormity of what I had done finally came crashing down on me. What had I just ruined? And could it ever be fixed? The days that followed were a blur of silence and tension. Mason and I danced around each other, speaking only when necessary and avoiding anything deeper than discussions about groceries or bills. He hadn't slept in our bed since that morning. Instead, I'd hear the creak of the couch late at night, followed by the muffled sounds of the TV. Each time, the ache in my chest grew sharper. Eliza reached out, of course. Her texts came in rapid bursts, first apologetic, then concerned, and finally angry when I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to face her. I had no words for what had happened between us, no explanation that wouldn't sound hollow or desperate. I deleted her messages without reading them in full, letting her slip further into the background as I focused on the mess I had made at home. One evening, Mason finally broke the silence. He was in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans filling the air as he prepared dinner. I hovered near the doorway, unsure if I should join him or retreat to the safety of the bedroom. "Are you going to stand there all night, or are you going to help?" he asked without looking at me, his voice devoid of warmth but not cruel. I hesitated before stepping forward, my hands fumbling for something to do. "What can I do?" "Chop the onions," he said, sliding a cutting board toward me. I obeyed, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the wood the only noise between us for a while. Finally, he spoke again, his tone measured. "Have you talked to her?" "No," I admitted. "I don't know what to say." He nodded, as though that was the answer he expected. "Do you still want to?" The question caught me off guard. I set the knife down, turning to face him. "No," I said quickly. "It was a mistake, Mason. It didn't mean anything." He stopped stirring the sauce on the stove, turning to look at me for the first time in what felt like days. "Didn't it?" he asked, his voice low. His gaze was steady, unflinching, and I felt myself shrink under it. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was a lapse in judgment, nothing more. But the truth was tangled and messy, and I didn't even understand it myself. "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know why it happened. I just know that it won't happen again." Mason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. It won't," he said, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. For a moment, I thought he might say more, might finally let me into the storm of emotions I knew he was hiding. But instead, he turned back to the stove, resuming his task as though the conversation had ended. That night, I found him sitting on the porch, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the small table beside him. The moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, and the cool breeze carried the faint scent of pine. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if he wanted my company. "Sit," he said without looking at me, his voice softer than it had been in days. I joined him, the wood of the porch cool against my legs. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We simply stared out into the dark, the silence between us no longer heavy but fragile, as though one wrong word could shatter it. "I don't think I'll ever understand why you did it," Mason said finally, his voice quiet. But I need to know if you regret it. I turned to him, my heart pounding. I do, I said without hesitation. I regret everything about it. I regret hurting you. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then we'll figure it out, he said simply. I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. We will. He turned to me, his expression tired but resolute. I'm not saying it'll be easy. Or quick. But I'm willing to try if you are. Tears welled in my eyes, and I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of my guilt was still there, but for the first time, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope that it wouldn't crush us completely. As the night stretched on, we sat together in the quiet, the beginnings of healing just barely taking root. There were no promises, no declarations of forgiveness, just the tentative steps of two people trying to find their way back to each other. The weeks that followed were agonizingly slow, each day a cautious negotiation between rebuilding and breaking apart. Mason and I tried to regain some semblance of normalcy, but everything felt different, fragile. The smallest misstep, a look, or a poorly chosen word seemed capable of undoing the tenuous progress we'd made. We agreed on one thing: we wouldn't sweep this under the rug. If there was going to be a future, it would require honesty. Mason asked for time, and I gave it to him. But the distance between us, both physical and emotional, was unbearable. Some nights he'd sleep on the couch, other nights, he'd come to bed but lie rigidly on his side, facing away from me. I'd lie awake, staring at his back, longing to reach out but terrified of rejection. It wasn't until one evening, after dinner, that we took a significant step forward. We were sitting at the table, the remnants of our meal between us. Mason pushed his plate aside, folded his hands, and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I need to ask you something, he said. Okay, I replied cautiously. Why didn't you stop it? The question landed like a punch. I wanted to recoil, to tell him it wasn't that simple, but I knew that wasn't fair. I had owed him this truth from the start. I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling. I wish I could give you an answer that made sense, but I can't. It was like, for a moment, everything else disappeared. I wasn't thinking about you, or her, or the consequences. I was just selfish. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Do you think about her now? No, I said firmly. Not like that. It wasn't about her, Mason. It never was. It was about me being reckless and stupid. He nodded slowly, as if turning my words over in his mind. And us? Do you still want this? Do you still want me? I reached across the table, my hand trembling as I placed it over his. More than anything. For the first time in weeks, his eyes softened. He didn't pull his hand away, and the faintest glimmer of hope sparked between us. One night, I woke to find Mason sitting on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped and his face buried in his hands. The faint glow of the moon through the curtains illuminated the room, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the turmoil within him. Can't sleep? I asked gently. He shook his head without looking at me. I sat up, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. Talk to me, Mason. Please. He let out a heavy sigh, then turned to face me. It's not just what happened, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's that I didn't see it coming. I thought we were solid, Hannah. I thought we were untouchable. And now, I don't know how to trust that again. I felt the tears pooling in my eyes, but I held them back. This wasn't about my pain. I don't expect you to trust me right now, I said. I've given you every reason not to. But I'm here, Mason. I'm not going anywhere, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that you can trust me again. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't name. Finally, he nodded, his hand reaching out to cover mine. I want to try, he said. But it's going to take time, Hannah. And I need to know you're ready for that. I am, I said without hesitation. I'm ready for whatever it takes. From that night on, we began the slow process of rebuilding. We started going to counseling, where we were forced to confront the cracks in our relationship that had led us to this point. It wasn't easy. Some sessions ended in tears, others in angry silence, but we kept showing up, kept trying. Mason set boundaries, and I respected them. He needed space to process, so I gave it to him, even when it hurt. We spent more time together, rediscovering the small things we'd taken for granted, cooking dinner side by side, walking in the park, laughing at old movies. I reached out to Eliza once, to tell her that I couldn't see her again. She didn't take it well, accusing me of using her and throwing her aside, but I stood firm. I owed her honesty, even if it came too late. Bit by bit, Mason and I found our way back to each other. The wounds hadn't fully healed, they might never fully heal, but there was a resilience in us that hadn't been there before. One evening, as we lay on the couch together, his arm draped around my shoulders, he turned to me and said, "I still love you, Hannah." The words broke me in the best possible way, and for the first time in months, I felt whole. Months passed, and though the tension between Mason and me hadn't entirely vanished, it had softened into something more manageable. Our nights grew warmer, our conversations more open. There were still moments of doubt, on both sides, but we learned how to navigate them, how to meet each other halfway. Our counselor once said that forgiveness wasn't a single moment but a process, a series of choices made over and over again. That wisdom carried us through the days when the weight of what had happened threatened to crush us. But I still carried guilt like a second skin, and I knew it was time to confront it fully. One evening, as we sat on the back porch under a canopy of stars, I turned to Mason, the words forming before I could stop them. "I think I need to forgive myself," I said softly, my voice trembling. Mason looked at me, surprised but not unkind. "Have you not?" "No," I admitted. "I've been punishing myself for what I did, holding on to the shame because I thought I deserved it. But I don't think I can move forward, not with you, not with us, until I let it go." He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "Hannah, I've already forgiven you. But maybe you're right. Maybe it's time you forgive yourself." Hearing him say it felt like a weight lifting from my chest, like I could finally breathe again. By the time the holidays rolled around, Mason and I were stronger than we had been in years. We'd fallen into a rhythm, one built on communication and vulnerability. It wasn't perfect, we still had our moments, but it felt real, grounded. On Christmas morning, we exchanged gifts in the living room, the twinkling lights of the tree casting a warm glow. Mason handed me a small, wrapped box, his smile hesitant but genuine. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with the words, "To us, always." Tears filled my eyes as I looked at him. "Mason, it's beautiful." He reached out, taking my hand. "It's a reminder," he said, "that no matter how hard things get, I'm in this with you. Always." I leaned forward, pressing my forehead to his. "Thank you," I whispered. "For everything." As we sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace. Life didn't return to what it had been before, it couldn't. But in its place, we built something new, something stronger. Mason and I became the kind of couple who fought for each other, who knew the value of what they had because they'd almost lost it. And while the scars of that fifth night remained, they became part of the tapestry of our story, a reminder of where we'd been and how far we'd come. As I watched Mason laugh one evening, the sound filling the room like music, I realized something profound: betrayal hadn't defined us. What defined us was our willingness to choose each other, every single day. And that was more than enough.